All right. Well, we can be the faithful few who make the video for everybody else so that they can catch up later. All
You'll
right.
have to feed us some questions that you want us to ask.
Yeah, I'll hold them up on a piece of paper
There you go.
so that it's not in
There
the
you go.
audio, and then you can ask them, and it'll be as if you were just coming up with these questions that were just perfect for where I was trying to get at.
That would be awesome.
All right. So I have a few notes about some more kind of historical context items that we want to cover before we get into this chapter. We're kind of moving through history a little bit. And Cindy, you might even be able to tell us some of this stuff because you just watched the other video and I talked about it a little bit in there.
Oh, I thought because I lived it. I thought maybe because I lived it.
No, not quite that, not quite that close to the present yet. We'll get there though.
Oh, okay.
So I kind of alluded to this a couple weeks ago, but the consensus among scholars is that the Book of Daniel qualifies as historical fiction. So there are some characters that appear who did exist, whose names and positions that are described existed as described, but generally speaking, the stories about the specific stories, the specific events, the specific characters like Daniel and his friends are understood to be creations of the process through which the Jews kind of tried to process and understand what was happening to them as a people. So the idea that Nebuchadnezzar converted to believing in the God of the Jews is very unlikely to have actually occurred to that historical character. In chapter 3 and in chapter 2, we had situations in which Nebuchadnezzar kind of glorifies the person, like glorifies Daniel, and says your God is awesome. But in this particular case, it gets a lot deeper than that. It's almost like he's converting to Judaism or to belief in the one God of the Jews. But historically, in terms of what we know of the historical facts from other sources, Nebuchadnezzar was actually pretty stubborn about the Jews and pretty mean to them, all the way to the end of his reign, until he died. And the reason we know that is because, this is something that there's evidence for in the Bible and in other sources. When Nebuchadnezzar died, his son-in-law became the next king, and within a couple of months of that king taking over, he actually released King Jehoiachin, who was the first king of Jerusalem to be taken into captivity. He, according to the biblical record, was in prison in Babylon for 37 years. And then within the first year of his reign, Nebuchadnezzar's successor releases him from jail, puts nice robes on him, and allows him to start hanging out in the royal court and eating dinner with the king and that kind of thing. So this massive turnaround from being in prison for 37 years under Nebuchadnezzar, and then within just a few months after Nebuchadnezzar dies, he's all of a sudden not, he's not released, he's not restored to his position as the king, he's still in exile, he's still a captive, but he's certainly being treated a lot better. So if Nebuchadnezzar did convert to Judaism, you would think that he would have released Jehoiachin and perhaps allowed him to become the king regent again, or at least not treated him quite as terribly as he did. So unlikely that this conversion happened to Nebuchadnezzar. Another historical item of interest here is that some scholars believe that this story actually refers to a different king, not to Nebuchadnezzar, but rather to Nabonidus, who is the last king of Babylon. He doesn't come immediately after Nebuchadnezzar. There were several others in between, but none of them lasted very long. for one reason or another. Some of them died in battle, others were murdered and committed suicide and all kinds of things like that. But Nabonidus was the one that lasted the longest after Nebuchadnezzar. But even within his reign, he spent a considerable amount of the time not in Babylon, not actually ruling. And instead, his son, whose name was Belshazzar, not to be confused with Belteshazzar, which is the name that they gave to Daniel in chapter 1. So Belshazzar is the son of Nabonidus, and he's the prince who rules in his father's stead, while his father decides that he's going to go off to this oasis town in Arabia and spend almost a decade there. And nobody knows why he went there. Nobody knows what was going on. And then eventually he did come back and start ruling again and doing what he needed to do. But for a significant chunk of his rule, he was nowhere to be found. And so I was thinking about this in terms of how could we get from this story about, this historical event of Nabonidus, the king of Babylon, being away for all these years, and then have that turn into Nebuchadnezzar going crazy and living in the wilderness for 7 years. And I was thinking about it in terms of, I don't know if either of you have heard about in the news, the president of Nicaragua has not been seen for over a month now. Have either of you heard about this?
No.
So apparently the president of Nicaragua is MIA. The vice president is constantly in the public eye and making statements on behalf of the president and claiming that the president is very busy trying to help the country with their response to the pandemic, and that he just doesn't have the time to come out and talk to anyone, but that he is well and is thinking of everyone and sends them well wishes and all these different things, but nobody has seen this guy for like 40 days.
What?
And so what happens in those kinds of situations when, for whatever reason, for the propaganda or the media spin or whatever it is, there's no information, there's a vacuum of information. We start to fill it in. And at first it's speculation and everybody knows it's speculation, but then eventually when a story gets passed on and on and on and on, then it becomes the truth. So if I were to say, oh guys, I did you hear that we haven't seen the president of Nicaragua for 40 days? What if he, got the disease and he's really sick? Or what if he even died from it and they don't want us to know about it? And then you turn around and you go to your friend and you say, oh, well, I heard that he died from COVID. And now all of a sudden that friend thinks that that's the truth. And so it's possible that that kind of thing was happening here too, that Nabonidus was gone. There was no information about why he had gone there or maybe even where he was for a lot of people. And so they start speculating. Well, maybe he went crazy and they are hiding him away somewhere so that we don't know about it. Maybe he has some kind of disease that they're trying to fix. We don't know. But if you are the Jews, you can then, of course, take that story and latch onto it and modify it slightly so that now, once again, it is another example of how God is present and active. Oh, well, the king disappears for a while. Why is that? Because God gave him this punishment to make him aware of how God has sovereignty over all things and the king doesn't. So that's kind of, I was thinking about how that might work. Another thing that is interesting and potentially at play here because of the acting like an animal, or, we don't know if he converts into an animal or if he's just acting like an animal. But the name of this king in the original Akkadian language, which is one of the languages of the Babylonians, his name would actually have been pronounced Nebuchadrezzar, and I didn't write down what that means, but the beginning of it is it's Nabu, protect my, and maybe it's protect my throne or protect my kingdom or something like that. Nebuchadrezzar with an R. But in the Bible, there's one place actually in Ezekiel and then in parts of Jeremiah where they use that form, Nebuchadrezzar. But in Daniel, he's called Nebuchadnezzar, which translates, Nabu, protect my jackass. And so there's a possibility that the name that they came up with to refer to this king is kind of a pun that's making fun of him. You know, we've talked in the last couple of sessions about how the way that they describe him and his behavior is so volatile and so over the top that it's almost parody. And so perhaps even the name that they use for him is a parody of the actual historical figure within the stories for the purpose of telling the story and making the point that they're trying to make. So all of those things are kind of swirling around in the background of what is going on in chapter 4, but obviously there is quite a bit more to be found within chapter 4 itself. So I will not make the two of you read this entire chapter by yourselves, but perhaps if we split it up among the three of us, we can get it out there. Let's see, how about I can read, mine chops off at between verses 18 and 19. So how about I read through 18, and then you two can fight over who wants to read through 27, and then who wants to read through the end. How does that sound?
Sounds good.
Okay. All right, so chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar's second dream. King Nebuchadnezzar, to all peoples, nations, and languages that live throughout the earth, may you have abundant prosperity. The signs and wonders that the Most High God has worked for me, I am pleased to recount. How great are his signs, how mighty his wonders. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and his sovereignty is from generation to generation. I, Nebuchadnezzar, was living at ease in my home and prospering in my palace. I saw a dream that frightened me. My fantasies in bed and the visions of my head terrified me. So I made a decree that all the wise men of Babylon should be brought before me in order that they might tell me the interpretation of the dream. Then the magicians, the enchanters, the Chaldeans, and the diviners came in and I told them my dream, but they could not tell me its interpretation. At last, Daniel came in before me, he who was named Belteshazzar after the name of my God, and who is endowed with the spirit of the gods. And I told him the dream. O Belteshazzar, chief of the magicians, I know that you are endowed with the spirit of the holy gods, and that no mystery is too difficult for you. Hear the dream that I saw. Tell me its interpretation. Upon my bed, this is what I saw. There was a tree at the center of the earth, and its height was great. The tree grew great and strong. Its top reached to heaven, and it was visible to the ends of the whole earth. Its foliage was beautiful, its fruit abundant, and it provided food for all. The animals of the field found shade under it. The birds of the air nested in its branches, and from it all living beings were fed. I continued looking in the visions in my head as I lay in bed, and there was a holy watcher coming down from heaven. He cried aloud and said, "Cut down the tree and chop off its branches. Strip off its foliage and scatter its fruit. Let the animals flee from beneath it and the birds from its branches. But leave its stump and roots in the ground with a band of iron and bronze in the tender grass of the field. Let him be bathed with the dew of heaven, and let his lot be with the animals of the field in the grass of the earth. Let his mind be changed from that of a human, and let the mind of an animal be given to him, and let 7 times pass over him. The sentence is rendered by decree of the watchers. The decision is given by order of the holy ones, in order that all who live may know that the Most High God is sovereign over the kingdom of mortals. He gives it to whom he will and sets over it the lowliest of human beings. This is the dream that I, King Nebuchadnezzar, saw. Now you, Belteshazzar, declare the interpretation, since all the wise men of my kingdom are unable to tell me the interpretation. You are able, however, for you are endowed with the spirit of the holy gods."
Okay, Ange, I'll read next. Then Daniel, also called Belteshazzar, I'm sorry, hard word, was greatly perplexed for a time, and his thoughts terrified him. So the king said, Belteshazzar, do not let the dream or its meaning alarm you. Belteshazzar answered, my lord, if only the dream applied to your enemies and its meaning to your adversaries. The tree you saw, which grew large and strong with its top touching the sky, visible to the whole earth with beautiful leaves and abundant fruit, providing food for all, giving shelter to the beasts of the field and having nesting places in its branches for the birds of the air. You, O king, are that tree. You have become great and strong. Your greatness has grown until it reaches the sky, and your dominion extends to distant parts of the earth. You, O king, saw a messenger, a holy one, coming down from heaven and saying, cut down the tree and destroy it, but leave the stump bound with iron and bronze in the grass of the field, while its roots remain in the ground. Let him be drenched with the dew of heaven, and let him live like the wild animals until 7 times pass by for him. This is the interpretation, O king, and this is the decree the Most High has issued against my lord and the king. You will be driven away from people and will live with the wild animals. You will eat grass like cattle and be drenched with the dew of heaven. 7 times will pass by for you until you acknowledge that the Most High is sovereign over the kingdom of men and gives them to anyone he wishes. The command to leave the stump of the tree with its roots means that your kingdom will be restored to you when you acknowledge that heaven rules. Therefore, O king, be pleased to accept my advice. Renounce your sins by doing what is right, and your wickedness by being kind to the oppressed. It may be that then your prosperity will continue.
And all this happened to King Nebuchadnezzar 12 months later. As the king was walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon, he said, is not this the great Babylon I have built as the royal residence by my mighty power and for the glory of my majesty? The words were still on his lips when a voice came from heaven. This is what is decreed for you, King Nebuchadnezzar. Your royal authority has been taken from you. You will be driven away from people and will live with the wild animals. You will eat grass like cattle. 7 times will pass by for you until you acknowledge that the Most High is sovereign over the kingdoms of men and gives them to anyone he wishes. Immediately, what had been said about Nebuchadnezzar was fulfilled. He was driven away from people and ate grass like cattle. His body was drenched with the dew of heaven until his hair grew like the feathers of an eagle and his nails like the claws of a bird. At the end of that time, I, Nebuchadnezzar, raised my eyes toward heaven, and my sanity was restored. Then I praised the Most High. I honored and glorified him who lives forever. His dominion is an eternal dominion. His kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the peoples of the earth are regarded as nothing. He does as he pleases with the powers of heaven and the peoples of the earth. No one can hold back his hand or say to him, what have you done? At the same time that my sanity was restored, my honor and splendor were returned to me for the glory of my kingdom. My advisors and nobles sought me out, and I was restored to my throne and became even greater than before. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and exalt and glorify the King of heaven, because everything he does is right and all his ways are just. And those who walk in pride, he is able to humble.
All right. So that one's, I guess we're done, right? That was pretty self-explanatory.
Just like that.
So you're both going to have to talk here because this, my style is you pick out what you want to talk about and then I pull up the note for it. So
Okay,
what is
I'll,
it?
I'll start.
All right.
Just a couple things, like just at the very beginning, that it's interesting to me that Nebuchadnezzar doesn't, where do I see it? So he tells them the dream. He doesn't make them tell him the dream like last time.
Right.
So he says, I told him the dream, and it doesn't sound like he's threatening to kill anybody if they can't tell him the dream or interpret it. So I'm like,
maybe
woo, way to go.
learning.
All right, you're learning, buddy.
I will point out, however, that this one, unlike the others, for the most part, except for that one section in the middle, which I find interesting, is written as if it were Nebuchadnezzar writing it. And so,
Yes.
interesting literary technique there. But also possibly, is Nebuchadnezzar a reliable narrator of his own story? Or should we, read that far into it and think, oh, well, gosh, he's not going to want to make himself look bad. Of course, the whole what happens to him in the middle part pretty much makes him look bad, but.
Yeah.
Well, I thought it was interesting that he gives the impression of being a believer in the true God. At least that's what I read into the first part. But the way that Daniel interprets the dream makes it sound like he's ready for some serious comeuppance.
Hmm.
Yeah. Sorry.
No. But then when the dream is fulfilled, he then does acknowledge that it was the true God, or it is the true God.
Yeah, so I think, kind of looking at the form of the chapter. So the chapter begins with verse 1. King Nebuchadnezzar, to all peoples, nations, and languages that live throughout the earth, may you have abundant prosperity. So that's typical for how you would open a letter. So, similar to Paul the apostle to the saints in place, blah, 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 blah. And then you write your letter. So it sounds to me like at least part of this is supposed to be the king recounting to the people what has happened to him. But then it's a question of what is the content of this letter and then what is not, because you get down to the split between verses 18 and 19. And instead of it says, this is the dream that I, King Nebuchadnezzar, saw. But then in verse 19, it says, Daniel was distressed and the king said, not I said. So this part of the story is not understood to be part of the letter. And so,
right.
And then it doesn't really come back until verse 34, when that period was over, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted my eyes to heaven. So I don't know, if perhaps it's possible that verses 1 through 18, this is the dream that I, King Nebuchadnezzar, saw. Now you, Belteshazzar, declare the interpretation. Since all the wise men of my kingdom are unable to tell you the interpretation, you are endowed with the spirit of the holy gods. So you would think that there would need to be something there then to tell what the content of the dream is, because then it skips straight over the interpretation to when that period was over, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted my eyes to heaven and my reason was returned to me. So I don't know. I didn't look into any text critical stuff on this particular issue to find out what they think is going on there in terms of how that came together. But it's possible that the person who put the book of Daniel together had these two separate stories that were written down about the same incident or same setting, same plot line, and kind of mashed them together and didn't bother to go back and fix the person in which the story was told or something, which happens. You can in certain places in the Bible, you can actually, if you work really hard at it, you can pull the stories apart. Like the story of Noah, there are actually two separate stories, and you can tell the difference between the two because of the word that they used to refer to God in the story. They didn't bother to smooth that over. So you've got the Yahweh version of the story and then the Elohim, God version of the story. So it could be something like that, that they smashed it together so that they could tell the whole story using these two parts. Where was I going with that? Who said something about it? Oh, that Nebuchadnezzar goes from seeming like he's on God's side to not, and then back to it again. So it's possible that that hymn of praise at the beginning is because he is supposed to be writing it now from the other side of his experience, telling, all of his people about, hey, this is where I've been for the last 7 years or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense.
And also, I find it interesting, kind of along those lines as well. Just as he's writing, though, it doesn't sound like he worships God alone, though, because, I mean, he's still, like in verse 8, he's reminding us that, I named Daniel Belteshazzar after the name of my God, is what he says. And then in verse 18, he says, but I know, Daniel, you can interpret it because the spirit of the holy gods is in you. And so even in the beginning and the end, like the doxology and praising the Most High, but it's still, I mean, he's acknowledging God as God, but not necessarily as Lord or the one true God.
Yeah, so maybe as a God to be added to the list,
right?
Or something like that.
In that middle section, it really amazes me that Daniel is so bold. I mean, he does not pull any punches when he interprets that dream.
Yeah.
And yet,
no, go ahead.
I was just going to say, yes. And like in verse 19, it says, I, Daniel, I was perplexed for a time and his thoughts terrified him. But the king said, don't let this alarm you. I still want to tell you what it means, but I'm going to be very thoughtful about how I say it. Like, even though here's a king who has taken him into captivity, exile, he still is honoring, Daniel is still honoring him in authority and wants to treat him with patience and kindness. And yeah, doesn't pull any punches, but he's still, again, is very careful about what he says, like with his friends, how he's like, let me go pray about this. You guys join me in prayer before I go before the king. It's kind of like he's doing the same thing. Like, I want to tell the truth, but I still need to honor, I need to honor my God, but I also need to honor the king.
Yeah. This morning, Louisa read to us from one of the commentaries that she looked up, and it said something that I thought was kind of interesting. It suggested that this dream actually wasn't something that would have been that hard to interpret for somebody like this. It's a pretty obvious kind of image. The symbol of the tree, the large, strong tree related to the king was very common at this time. So, the tree being the king is pretty obvious. All the animals and plants that rely on the tree, and the birds nest in its branches and all these kinds of things, that's the king's protection of the people and concern for and responsibility over the people that that are in the king's kingdom, that kind of thing. And so these guys should have been able to just tell him, but maybe it's not that they couldn't, it's that they didn't want to. They were afraid of what he would do if they told him the interpretation. And so Daniel was the only one who was willing to stick his neck out and and tell the dream and explain it to him, because he cares about this king, even though he is captive and all that kind of thing. And you know, if we look at it from a literary standpoint, it kind of goes back again to that comparison between the king and this Daniel character, who is always pure and always perfect. And even though he is technically the slave of this king, doesn't he love his king and want what's best for his king and all that kind of thing. So I thought that was an interesting interpretation, and that makes a lot of sense.
Well, even when he says, oh, if only this applied to your enemies, if only this were if it were possible for me to interpret this dream as if it were your enemies to which it applied, but it doesn't. It applies to you.
Right.
So, I mean, that I think demonstrates what you said in terms of the fact that he did have, he did admire or respect Nebuchadnezzar.
Yeah. And especially considering technically, you know, maybe not by this point, but at one point, his people were the enemy of King Nebuchadnezzar. So
Yeah.
is he talking about himself here, or is maybe he's talking about, you know, the current enemies, not the ones that he's already conquered?
Yeah. Interesting. Well, I also found it interesting that one of the ways that Nebuchadnezzar explained it was that he had lost his sanity for 7 years.
Mm-hmm.
That was his way when he returned to people. That was his way of sharing what had happened.
Yeah. So, you know, so in terms of what this is supposed to be referring to, you know, we don't know. It has this description of eating grass like cattle, and long hair, long nails. So are we supposed to see this as him actually turning into a donkey or turning into some other kind of creature? Or is he still in a human form, but has lost his mental faculties, and so he's living out in the wilderness, eating grass and, you know, doing things that a normal person with their regular brain function would not do? We don't know what it is that they're trying to get at here exactly. But, you know, as I always say, I don't really care what it's supposed to be referring to specifically, because I don't think that's the point. I don't think we're supposed to be looking for, you know, the historical accuracy of this, because it is very unlikely that it happened at all. But what is the point? What's the point behind the story? Which is that, you know, God is able to do this to Nebuchadnezzar, whatever this is. God clearly, once again, you know, with this theme that we've seen throughout so far, the book of Daniel, of God's sovereignty over that of the king, God as the source and giver of life, who can give success and authority and power, and can also take it away at any moment, you know, on a whim, if you want to interpret it that way, or for the purpose of punishing, if you want to interpret it that way, or, you know, for whatever reason, God can do that, and does in this case. But
well, I think a lot of
nope, go ahead.
I think a lot of women, if this shelter in place lasts too much longer, can identify with his hair grew like feathers of an eagle and his nails like the claws of a bird.
Yeah, so far I have cut all of my family's hair except for my own. I don't know if I could get away with that, but we'll see. Depending on how long this goes, we'll see how bad it gets.
Funny.
Yep.
But one area that I think is really interesting is the description of what's to be done with the tree when it's cut down. Cut the tree, this is verse 14, cut down the tree and chop off its branches, strip off its foliage and scatter its fruit, let the animals flee, the birds from its branches, but leave the stump and roots in the ground with a band of iron and bronze in the tender grass of the field. So I think once again, that's kind of pointing to that remnant, that hope, that grace of God. The band of iron and bronze is supposed to be kind of control. So you could No, I'm sure that you've cut down a tree before. We just cut down a tree in our front yard last year. It was kind of drooping down, and one of the really big branches broke and was hanging down over our sidewalk, and so we cut the tree off. And now we've got this enormous bush. It was a eucalyptus tree, and we've got this enormous bush now because from the stump you got all the little shoots that stick out from the sides, and they all grew up into each other, and now we have this huge bush where this tree used to be. And so in order to prevent that from happening in the ancient world, they would put these bands of metal on the stump so that it couldn't grow anything until they decided that they wanted it to grow again, or if they did want it to grow again. And so that, I think, is kind of an allusion to God controlling the situation. So it's not just that they cut him off and then allow him to do what he's going to do. They cut him off and then control the amount of time that's going to pass before he's freed to be restored to his kingdom. But it's very specific. The stump and the roots must be left in the ground. So this isn't a permanent thing. This isn't a final execution of the king, or a removal of him from power, or from his actual life. But it is there, that grace is still there, that forgiveness is still there. So I think that's a really important part of the story that's going on here. There's also the suggestion that there is a dual interpretation for this. So we've got the king, we've got if you read it from the perspective of the tree as the king, then it's another example of God's sovereignty over any other power on earth, and God can take and restore at any time. But if you go back again to that idea that's developing among the Jews at this time, of the remnant, of the small piece of hope that they can hold on to, that even though they've lost so much, there's still that kernel that's remaining, and as long as that kernel is there, then they have hope of eventual restoration someday. And so then if we interpret the tree as the people of Israel, then we've got images of what is the purpose of the people of Israel, what is the purpose of the chosen people, not to make them special over against other nations, but to be a blessing to other nations. So they, as the tree, are supposed to be sheltering all the other nations as the birds and the branches and the animals underneath the leaves and things like that. But are they doing that? No, they have not been. And there's this continuous cycle through the history of the Jewish people, all the way from the beginning of they encounter God, they believe in God, they say, yes, we're going to do what you ask us to do, we're going to take care of the world, we're going to be the people that you call us to be. And then they forget and they go off and they start doing their own thing and not treating the poor the way that they're supposed to, and all these kinds of things. And so then you can interpret it as God is punishing them, or you can interpret it as the natural consequences of not being the people that God calls you to be happen, and your relationships with the world aren't right, and so you fall into the natural consequences of that, and then it looks like you're being punished by God, and then God sends someone to save you. And that's basically the entire book of Judges, is this cycle, and then that continues even through the kings and the prophets and into this point. And so the idea of the stump is left every time for that restoration because of that love of God and that grace of God. And I think that isn't a bad interpretation here either, kind of as a secondary level symbolism for the tree as the people of Israel, especially where it says why this is happening, and I have to find the verse. Here. So in verse 27, right when the event actually happens, or right before the event actually happens, therefore, O king, may my counsel be acceptable to you. This is Daniel speaking. Atone for your sins with righteousness and your iniquities with mercy to the oppressed, so that your prosperity may be prolonged. So it's not just that the king is arrogant and thinks that he has more power than God, although that is certainly part of it. You know, the moment of his actual punishment comes in right after verse 30, right after the king has been bragging, "Is this not magnificent Babylon, which I have built as a royal capital by my mighty power, for my glorious majesty?" Well, guess what? This is how it's going to be now. So there's clearly that element of needing to be humble and needing to understand your position in relationship to God. But there in verse 27, your iniquities with mercy to the oppressed. So clearly the bigger issue is not so much that he's using his power to glorify himself, but that he's not using his power to help other people, to help the more vulnerable among him. And that fits in with that interpretation, that dual interpretation with the Jews. The purpose of God choosing the descendants of Abraham is not so that they get to be special and be the only ones who God blesses, but they are to be a blessing to the nations because of their special relationship with God. And when they're not doing that, then God comes in and says, "Hey, remember how this wasn't supposed to be about all the rule following and the worshiping in the right way, but it was really supposed to be about how you treat each other and how you treat other people, and you're not doing it right, so let's try again." So there's certainly some of that going on here too, I think.
Kind of along those lines, I'm just curious, because as you were talking about Israel, like I never thought of the tree being Israel, but then like in verse 15, it talks about let him be drenched with the dew of heaven. And then again in verse 25 and then verse 23, so even as he's been cut down, that he's still being sustained with the dew of heaven. I don't know what word, but that reminds me of manna, right?
Yeah.
So like it's still, even in your disobedience, even in your ignorance, even in your just not honoring me, like you said, the grace of God, I'm still going to sustain you. I'm still going to but again, I don't know if that's the same word, but it just reminded me of that.
Yeah. While we're here talking, I can look that up and see. I'm pretty sure that this chapter is in Aramaic, so it might be a little more challenging to find that
Right.
that comparison. But yeah, I mean, I would say that certainly isn't a bad interpretation. It doesn't, you know, the translation in my Bible as well is dew of heaven. And so I feel like there's a reason for that. Certainly it doesn't just say rain.
Yeah.
You know, if it was just about, this is part of the punishment that he's going to get soaking wet all the time because he's outside in the rain, you know, then it would just say, you'll eat grass and you'll get soaking wet all the time from the rain. But it doesn't say rain, it says dew of heaven. And that is a really interesting idea that might be alluding in that direction.
Yeah.
That it's not,
like I said, I never thought of it talking about Israel, but that was awesome, Katie. Thank you.
Well, and just the use, you know, we don't usually think of a person being drenched by dew, but that's the way it's stated each time.
yeah.
Again, the relentless pursuit of God for his people.
Yeah, that and the we talked a little bit about the verse, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted my eyes to heaven and my reason was returned to me, and kind of what the relationship is between those two actions, and whether, you know, is that, gosh, it took me 7 years to realize that all I had to do was acknowledge God and then I would be restored, and God's just been waiting around for that to happen? Or is it, you know, God knew that it was going to take 7 years, and so that was just happened to be the time that was told, because that was, you know, God knowing everything all the time and being omnipotent? Or if it's that God if there's this, you know, animalistic thing going on, this idea of, you know, I don't know that I'm a human, my brain isn't functioning as a human. And I think that it says something about that somewhere, that it's not just that he's out there doing those things, but that he would actually think like an animal. I don't see that. That's not in verse 33. 25 doesn't have it. Yeah, I'm not seeing it. It's in there somewhere that it says something about that he's got the mind of an animal, not just the behavior of an animal. And so it kind of reminds me, actually, interestingly, of this book that I read with my kids a couple weeks ago about a donkey, actually, interestingly enough, who finds a rock. He collects rocks, and he finds this really cool rock, and he rubs the rock, and as he's holding the rock, he says something like, "Oh no, it's starting to rain. I wish that I had an umbrella." And then an umbrella appears, and so he realizes that this is a magical rock. And on his way home to tell his parents about this rock that he found, he encounters a lion who wants to eat him. And so in his panic, he thinks, "Oh gosh, I wish that I was a stone." And so he magically turns into a stone, and the rock falls away from him, and so he can't turn back into a donkey because the stone is not touching him. And eventually his parents find him somehow, and he gets turned back into a donkey. But there's a difference, I think, between, you know, being in a situation where you have the cognitive ability to get to reason your way out of it and not doing it, versus being in a position where you have no ability to act, like the donkey that turned into a rock, or like a person who has the mind of an animal. So is it fair for God to ask this person who has been given the mind of an animal to repent before he can be turned back into a human? And is that what's really going on here? But I think that again goes to, you know, kind of God's sovereignty and our unworthiness of God's grace, but God gives it to us anyway. We are all like animals who don't listen and don't do what we're supposed to do, and God constantly forgives us and restores us and gives us another chance all the time. So, yeah, I think that's probably something like what's going on there. God gives the gift of looking to heaven and being able to be cognizant of God's presence, and then on top of that gift gives the gift of returned reason so that he can understand what has just happened to him. What else do we have? Anything?
I'm just led to think that this also shows that God's grace reaches everyone.
Mm. Anything
And I
about
think,
that?
well, it's just, here was Nebuchadnezzar who thought, you know, he ruled the world as was known, and whatever he said was law, and he had no reason to think that he needed God, but God was still able to reach him. And then he, not because of anything that Nebuchadnezzar did,
Mm-hmm.
but because of God's faithfulness.
Yeah, and once again, too, we're kind of getting used to this at this point, but again, remembering that this is unusual that a god would, be represented as having any kind of authority or control in the lives of people outside of that religious tradition.
Yeah, yeah. That he wasn't just the God of the Jews.
Yeah.
Some foreshadowing.
So in Exodus, when it talks about the manna, it's called bread from heaven in the literal translation.
Okay.
And there are other places that talk about the dew from heaven. That phrase appears in Genesis in terms of actual dew, but it is referring to specifically because this is a fairly arid place, and so they don't get a lot of rain, but what they do get is heavy dew that is what kind of waters their crops more often than actual rain does. And so
Okay.
the bread from heaven that comes as manna is formed in the same way as dew. And so I can imagine very easily that there's a theological connection between dew and the bread from heaven, referring to the manna that was given to the Israelites, for sure. That's a really good insight.
Yeah, it's also interesting, I think, that in 34 he talks about I praise the Most High, honored and glorified him who lives forever. But then in 36, at the same time that my sanity was restored, my honor and splendor were returned to me from the glory of my kingdom. For the glory of my kingdom, my advisors and nobles sought me out, and I was restored to my throne and became even greater than before. So, and then the next verse does talk about praising and glorifying the King of Heaven, but he has to slip that little bit in there about how great he is too.
Right. Still more greatness was added to me.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
But it ends with, and those who walk in pride, he is able to humble.
Yeah. So certainly something of the humility and what's the word I'm looking for? The humility of service, I guess, is in there.
But he doesn't sound anything. He doesn't sound humble at all in the verses before in 36.
No.
So I don't know if he's referring to himself, or if he's referring to all those other people.
It's possible, for him, it's definitely a couple of ticks down from where he normally is. So, for normal people, it's pretty arrogant if I go around talking about, well, I went through some hard times and had some mental health issues, but I'm back and I'm better than ever. That sounds a little weird, but if you're the king and you're used to hearing him talk about how great you are and how you have to bow down to me all the time and all this, and now all of a sudden he's praising someone beside himself, maybe that's pretty good for him.
Yeah, could be.
Well, we don't have to belabor this forever unless you've got anything else to add. We can wrap it up for this evening. We're starting to get into some of the weird stuff. Next week we'll get some even more weird stuff with the writing on the wall and what does all that mean.
Yeah.
And then we'll have a little break with the Lion's Den, but then we'll start getting into the apocalyptic craziness. So I will certainly have a lot to say about how apocalypticism works. I was kind of hoping that this whole being stuck at home thing would go away in time for me to just do through chapter 6 and then we'll stop doing this now. But I think we're gonna keep going. So put on your crash helmets, people.
Thank you.
Here we go. Yeah. Thanks, Katie.
You are very welcome. How about I will pray us out here today, since you two did so much
That would
work
be
for me
wonderful.
today. All right, let's pray. Heavenly Father, I thank you so much for these two wonderful women and for their insights and for their faithfulness to you. I pray that you would be with all of us as we continue to sometimes struggle, sometimes learn, sometimes enjoy ourselves through this time of being at home. I pray that you would give us strength for the moments that are challenging and give us joy for the moments that are enjoyable. Pray that you would be with all of us as we depart from this time and place together into the rest of our evenings. Keep us safe, keep us healthy, and bring us back together again next week for more learning about you and about our relationship with you. Pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen.